Hello, today I want to talk about one of the most important and probably well-known stories in the Bible outside of the Big Five, which is Jesus, Adam and Eve, Noah, Moses, and Joseph. I put Adam and Eve together. Sorry. This story is so well known and so familiar to Christians, and that's why I think it's important to revisit. With a lot of stories that we grow familiar with, we kind of lose their meaning and value. Think of it like the Christmas story. I probably heard the story of Jesus' miraculous birth for almost 30 years, and that means I've probably heard it preached at least 60 times, because you can't just do one Christmas sermon. You gotta give the people what they want, and they want more Christmas sermons. I think at least that's what we've all been led to believe with all these Christmas events that go on. I don't know. And on top of those sermons, I've probably read multiple books, seen movies, TV shows, listened to Adventures in Odyssey tapes. There's probably a Miggy and Me video in there somewhere. And after a while, you kind of get so familiar with the story that it kind of loses its value and its grandeur. And I think that's what happens with the story of Job for a lot of Christians. It's something that we've heard so many times, and it's the kind of the default response to someone that experiences even like a modicum of suffering. Your car broke down, man, you're just like Job. Your internet cut out, oh wow, look to Job, man. Your iPhone deleted all your text messages, geez. Job's friends would tell you to curse God and die. Obviously, I'm joking, but that's really not too much of an exaggeration of some Christians, including me, how we tend to treat Job's story. So I want to take just a little bit of time and look at the beginning of the story of Job. So we're not going to go through the whole book. That's another series a long way down the road. I just want to look at the intro and see what we can glean from this book, and see if we can restore some of the value and weight that comes with any story from the Word of God. So let's dive in and see where we end up. You can feel free to follow along in your own Bible, so that you know I'm not inserting anything or reading anything weird. I'm just going to start at Job 1 and read a bit. I might summarize a few things here and there, and we'll see if we can get into the meat of this story. So no more delays. Let's jump into Job 1. So, starting Job 1, verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. So let's stop right there. There's a few things to note. First, Job lived in Uz. Now, we don't really have any idea where Uz is located, or was located. There's a few guesses because of some clues in the Old Testament, but we don't really know for sure. What we do know is that Job lived sometime after the great flood of Noah, because it's referenced later in the book, but long before the time of Moses. We know that because based on the few verses, and again, some references later on, Job's lifestyle reflected that of a patriarch before the Israelite law was in place, so before Moses. Moving further into verse 1, Job is described as blameless and upright. This is the same description given to Noah and Abraham, which should speak to how greatly God viewed Job. He was, for all intents and purposes, a righteous man. Moving on, verses 2 through 5 explain the wealth that Job has experienced. He's got 7 sons, 3 daughters, a ton of livestock, and a bunch of servants to help out. Job was incredibly wealthy, and we get a pretty clear picture of that in this passage. But we are also reminded of his uprightness and how he loved the Lord. So, okay, picking up at verse 6, we read the infamous interaction between God and Satan. So again, starting at verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. All right, so let's unpack what we just read, because there are some really important pieces of information here. So first, in verse 6, we see that the sons of God came before God. Well, who are they? Well, this was a term in the Old Testament that was used to refer to heavenly beings. So kind of like a heavenly council of sorts. So they gather before God, and then it says Satan came into the midst of them. The word used for Satan is accuser or adversary, and this fits the usual Old Testament description of Satan. And note that he wasn't one of the sons of God. It doesn't say that he was with them. It says that he just kind of came into the midst of them. So he just kind of showed up to this meeting of the council of God. So God asks Satan, where did you come from? And Satan just says like, I've been wandering around the earth. So God uses this opportunity to highlight his servant Job. Since Satan has been all over the earth, surely he's heard of this man. Satan's response to this question from God is to belittle the man of God. And that's the same tactic that he still uses with us today. He's an accuser. He's a counterfeit. He always takes what God creates and says is good and makes it lesser. So that's what he does with Job. He tells God that the only reason Job reveres or fears God is because of the blessings God has given him. And then Satan gives God a proposition. He says that if God will stretch out his hand and touch all that he has, and that word touch is better translated to be striking, if he reaches out and strikes all that he has, he will curse you to your face. And so God then gives Satan permission to stretch out his hand against Job's blessings, but he can't touch Job. Okay, so let's stop and look at what's happening here. Job is just going about his life. He's worshiping God. He's fulfilling his role as the patriarch of his family, sacrificing what he needs to and taking care of those in his charge. And then God brings him up to Satan and says, hey, have you seen how awesome Job is and how much he loves me? Of course, Satan's response is to belittle and accuse, and this wasn't a surprise to God. None of this was. You can see through all of this how God is sovereignly working in all of it. The only thing Satan can do in this situation is propose things. He says to God, hey, if you'd let me take all that stuff from Job, he'd turn on you in a second. He actually can't do anything without God's permission. And so God loosens his leash, loosens the leash of Satan, and says, you can do these things, but don't touch Job. So if you're reading this properly, the suffering of Job is prompted, permitted, and you'll see in a little bit, acted out by God. And so, with the plan set in motion, Job comes across a truly horrible day. Verses 13 through 19 depict the terrible suffering that comes to Job, all in a span of what seems like a few minutes. It starts with his livestock, the oxen and donkeys. The Sabaeans stole them and killed all the servants that were there, except for the one who escaped to tell him about it. And while that servant is speaking to Job, another comes and says that the fire of God fell from heaven and burned his sheep and the servants tending to them. And while he was still speaking, another servant came and said that the Chaldeans stole his camels and killed the servants that were tending to them, except for him. And while that servant was still speaking, another servant came to tell Job that while his children were gathered to eat and drink, a great wind blew the house down and killed them all. It's hard to even talk about this because the pain Job felt here must be unimaginable. I can't even begin to put myself, to even think about what it'll be like to put myself in Job's shoes. I have experienced pain and loss, but nothing close to this extent. Job literally has everything ripped from him. All of his material blessings and even his family, his offspring, his legacy is ripped from him. And I mentioned earlier that these events were acted out by God, and I want to circle back to that because that's important. Look at these 4 events that take place. Let's categorize them. First, we have the category of human actions. The Sabaeans and the Chaldeans steal oxen and camels, and then they kill Job's servants. Now, Satan is involved in all of this and can influence the minds of humans. He whispers lies and can incite reactions, but who ultimately takes credit for the actions of nations? Well, let's see what God says elsewhere in his word. If you turn to Isaiah 10, you'll see how God talks about the Assyrians. Verse 5 of Isaiah 10 says that God plans to use the nation of Assyria as a rod to strike against and punish the nation of Israel. He says that he will send Assyria to do this. But then something crucial happens in verse 7. God says that he will send Assyria to plunder and tread down on Israel, and then in my translation of verse 7 says, but he, the king of Assyria, does not so intend, and in his heart does not so think. Well, what does that mean? Well, when you're reading the full context, it means that God is sending Assyria to punish Israel, but Assyria is doing that because they want to, not because they want to be obedient to God. The New Living Translation of verse 7 says something along the lines of, the king of Assyria does not intend to be God's tool. So he's going to strike Israel because he wants to, and because God is sending them. It's God's plan to have them strike. But then what happens when you get to verse 12 of Isaiah 10? It says that God is going to punish the Assyrians for their actions. So God is orchestrating the plan for the Assyrians to strike against the Israelites, and then he's going to punish them for it. And the same thing happens here in Job. The Sabaeans and the Chaldeans strike out against Job according to the direction of God, and because they wanted to. They wanted Job's stuff. Job was famously wealthy and would have surely attracted the attention of rival nations or gangs. But the other category of suffering for Job comes about of these crazy natural events. Fire falls from the sky, which could just be lightning, or maybe it was a pillar of fire like we see in the story of Exodus, and then a great wind, which could have been a tornado, or again, some sort of supernatural wind that came through. Now, ask yourself, does Satan have control over natural events like this? Does the Word of God ever credit the accuser, the enemy, the counterfeit with anything like this? And so when Job's servant comes to him and says that the fire of God fell from heaven, we can assume that he's being theologically accurate. It was from God. And so let's go back to Job. He just received horrifying news from all directions. The suffering is weighing deep on Job. What is his reaction? What does he do? So picking up in verse 20, then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I come from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Job hears that God has orchestrated the emptying of every blessing he's been given. And Job's immediate response is to grieve and worship. The tearing of robes and the shaving of heads was a sign of grief, and Job grieves for sure. But his follow-up after is to worship God. Seriously, have you ever reacted to suffering like this? I mean, any suffering in your life. Has your response ever been to fall on the ground and worship God? Job understands what has happened here, at least from the proper understanding of who is responsible. You can see that in his words. The Lord gave me those blessings, and the Lord has taken away those blessings. Regardless of what I have, blessed be the name of the Lord. And now there's a lot more to the story of Job. We just went through chapter 1, and there's another 42 chapters to go through. But I want to pull this key lesson that I think we need to be reminded of as often as possible. The story of Job teaches that the value of God alone is more valuable than the gifts that come from God. That's the accusation that Satan levels against Job at the start of this chapter. He says that Job will curse God as soon as God pulls those blessings from him. Like kind of like a toddler that has their toy taken away and just immediately descends into a fit of madness. That's what Satan expected. And sometimes that's how we live our lives. And trust me, I'm going through this text because it's a reminder that I need more than anyone else. I need the reminder that whether I have just God or God plus blessings, that God is still good and God is still worthy of praise. Having God alone is enough. And I hope this encourages you to seek him in that and to truly understand the value of God in our lives. I don't know where you may be. Maybe you've experienced loss or setback in your life. Maybe you feel the attacks of the enemy and he's just pouring it on thick. I don't know where you're at. But what we do know as Christ followers is that God is sovereignly ruling in all of that. The enemy isn't just running rampant and God is struggling to get control of him. The enemy is on a leash. And God is working in your blessing and in your suffering to remind you that he alone is God and he alone is worthy of praise. So thank you for watching this video. I hope it encourages you. If you want to discuss this topic, or maybe you agree or disagree on something, I would love to hear from you. Maybe I mentioned something that you want to get more clarity, or you want to provide more clarity from me, let me know. I really would love to hear from you. So thank you again for watching this video. God bless, and I'll see you soon.